Welcome to the Foreign Tigers podcast with me, Louis.
And with me, Erik.
Welcome to another edition of the Foreign Tigers podcast, Global Edition, where Louis and I discuss topics going on in the world outside of Korea. We have something special for you today, because today's episode is the first in a two-part series.
In this series, we will explore the current state of dysfunction in liberal democracies, the crisis in neoliberalism that has brought us here, and the ideologies vying to overtake the fragmenting world order. Today's episode centers on Giovanni Arrighi's book, The Long 20th Century, and how it both theorizes the end of the current American-led capitalist order and predicts what comes next.
To help us chart a course through this conversation, we're joined by a special guest today, a doctor of philosophy, and our former professor at Korea University, Professor Cuz Potter. Cuz holds a PhD in urban planning from Columbia University and teaches international development at KU's Graduate School of International Studies. He leads the Development Futures Lab, which researches the impacts and potential contributions of emerging technologies on international development. Beyond being a wellspring of knowledge, Cuz is also a truly excellent educator and mentor to his students.
Cuz, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you. It's a bit weird to not call you professor, but we're super delighted to have you here.
I like to keep it informal. I'm pleased to be here.
Well, yeah, it's great to have you here. And then just for disclosure for the audience, I used to work as one of his research assistants at the Development Futures Lab. It's an experience I highly recommend if you can do it. So to be here talking over the podcast app, yeah, it really feels like I'm in grad school again.
Same here. It's like I never left. Actually, Professor Potter and I have known each other a while. Even when I was at SOAS, we met via Zoom during COVID times. So we're excited to hear your insights as we discuss the end of the current stage of capitalism.
Essay will be due next week.
So to set the scene, as many of you know, the world's pretty crazy right now. Russia's engaged in a war in Ukraine. India and Pakistan attacked each other earlier. China is continually threatening to invade Taiwan. The U.S. is blowing up fishermen off the coast of Venezuela. And all the while, crypto bros are shelling crypto schemes and social media is rotting brains. Clearly, the situation for the American-led post-war order is complicated, to put it mildly.
That's an interesting choice of indicators, but I'd agree that that's putting it rather mildly. So what to make of the increasing disorder? For that, we turn to Arrighi and his book, The Long 20th Century. Cuz, could you explain a bit more about Arrighi's core arguments?
I can certainly try. His basic notion is that capitalism actually has an incredibly long history that stretches back to at least the 1400s. And that it has experienced up to the time that he was writing, which I think was early 80s. I think 1984 is the date of the book, had gone through 4 long centuries, 4 broad phases that he calls systemic cycles of accumulation. So there are broadly 4 cycles of accumulation. There's an earlier Genoese cycle, a Dutch cycle, a British cycle, and as he was writing, there was an American cycle, which we can talk about later on. But the basic notion is that each cycle goes through a phase of commercial expansion and then financial expansion. And underlying the idea is a set of ideas from the regulationist school of Marxist thinking, which basically explored the question of why capitalism hadn't collapsed of its own devices and collapsed in upon itself. And so what the regulationist school begins to explore is by what mechanisms, by what device, what kind of organization capitalism manages to remain coherent and to perhaps adapt to changes around it. So it's this idea of how does capitalism regulate itself in order to maintain itself over the long term. And what Arrighi's strategy is to suggest that over these long centuries, capitalism under the different hegemons that I mentioned, the Genoese, the Dutch, the British, the Americans, has organized itself into a sort of particular system of relations that has managed to reproduce itself for an extended period of time. So that's the basic notion of a systemic cycle of accumulation.
So could you elaborate on what it means to be a hegemon in the capitalist system? Does it differ from the IR concept of being this overwhelmingly powerful state in international system?
Yeah. I mean, so again, for full disclosure here, I'm a bit of an interloper into both the sort of historical analysis of the evolution of capitalism and into the sort of IR components of this. But my understanding is that typically hegemon in the classic IR sense is the power that dominates other powers and is able to compel other states typically to do what they to follow their will, right? To do what the state wants to do, and that's the sort of traditional notion of hegemon. But Righi himself is drawing the notion from his fellow Italian Gramsci, who in the notebooks develops a common notion of hegemony, which is in a sense a bit softer than this sort of hardcore notion of hegemon, in which more than just coercion, it also involves consent to be led by the hegemon. So if you have it doesn't mean that the hegemon doesn't dominate some countries, it doesn't coerce some countries, but there is a certain level at which that hegemon has to take on a leadership role in managing the global economy, basically. And it does so as an example, either by dominating other countries and then other additional countries decide that, oh, well, this is scary or this is good for me. So I'll join in that system. Uh, or it can simply be that it does provide a very positive and beneficial arrangement among the states um, uh, that induces additional states to follow the hegemon, which is to say, ultimately, sorry, that that the hegemon themselves uh, um, sort of takes the lead in managing the global economy.
And that kind of speaks to the system that we're living in now, right? Like post World War II, majority of nations joined the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, and all of these global governing bodies. In some ways, the US is the hegemon, but there is a consent, or to differing degrees among members in those organizations, right? So that speaks to kind of the current state of play.
Yes, and that's exactly some of the key components that Arrighi identifies for the American systemic cycle of accumulation, right? The US set up the UN, it set up the IMF, it set up the World Bank, all of the Bretton Woods institutions in such a way as to serve its own needs on the global scale. And as you are implying, it created a system that was fairly stable and beneficial to many of the adherents and participants in that system. So, yeah, exactly that.
So America is the fourth hegemon in Arrighi's framework. Then going back, how do can we talk a little bit about the features of the different hegemons? Like Louis mentioned, America has this international system that we've set up. What about these other hegemons? Do we see similar traits, similar characteristics across each one? And how does the capitalist system evolve as it goes from one hegemon to the other?
Okay, well, there's a whole book about that. Uh, um, so let me start not by talking about the specific characteristics of the different cycles, but this arc of each cycle, so that we can actually start to identify some of the similar characteristics across them. Right. So I had mentioned earlier on that there is a phase of commercial expansion followed by a phase of financial expansion, which I didn't, and what I didn't mention is that there's then a phase of what Arrighi calls systemic chaos, in which the sort of pre-existing rules all break down and the world economic system reorganizes itself and a new hegemon takes over. So, what happens during the first phase of each of these systemic cycles of accumulation is that there a, a new system for organizing the global economy emerges. So, and this is going to take different kinds of forms depending on the cycle of accumulation, but it involves things like the relationship between capitalists and labor. It involves the relationship between capitalist merchants and the states around them. It involves particular forms of technology that facilitate a particular a particular set of relations. It might involve particular military organizations that allow for the perpetuation of and defense of these kind of systems. And so the notion is that these sets of relations, and this might sound abstract, and which is, but we will make that concrete when we talk about some of the individual phases. Uh, is that these sort of gel into a kind of not rigid, but a coherent system of relations that allows that system to perpetuate itself over decades and decades, even perhaps longer. Um, and during this period, it's because it's a new way of organizing trade and production, the focus is on expanding trade in commodities, the production and trade in commodities. So this is the commercial piece of the expansion uh, phase, right? So there's a new system that produces commodities in a new, more efficient, more profitable way. And for merchants, for quite a long time, it's valuable for those merchants, profitable for those merchants to invest in expanding that system, right? So you have this is a kind of, you have an innovative in the same way. Let me present it like this: in the same way that a firm, you've talked about Apple and what have you on the podcast, might introduce a new kind of technology for communication or what have you. They're in a position, at least in the beginning, to collect a huge amount of profits until other companies are able to compete with them and sort of, in theory, reduce their profit margin, right? So the same way that Apple might reorganize itself or organize itself in a new and innovative way that allows it to obtain higher profit levels at the beginning, Arrighi is suggesting that an entire political economic system can do the same thing. So with a new set of relations between the state and capital, capital and labor, um, the state and other states, that there is a period of higher than normal profitability that encourages domestic merchants or merchants in general, but to invest in expanding that system. And so this goes for a while, but as we know from even mainstream economics, there is a phase of diminishing returns. And so after a while, those profits sort of get competed away, and that system's robustness, I mean, it's still going to be functioning, it's still going to be carrying itself forward, but it's not quite as robust, it's not quite as profitable, as it had been before. And so once the profits, once the profits do get reduced to a particular level, it eventually becomes the case that those merchants who would have invested in expanding that set of commercial relations and expanding trade in commodities, that particular form of trade in commodities, choose to try to invest in either financial devices or in new forms of production and organization, which is when the cycle enters its financial expansion phase. So again, right? So if you're unable to make profits by expanding trade, you take your extra profits and you start investing in, say, tulips or stocks, and potentially inflate those values, which is financializing the economy. Um, but along the way, uh, in theory, uh, a new way of organizing production begins to emerge at some point. And so, if you are the dominant uh, capital possessor of capital, then you begin to invest in these new sort of startup firms, this new startup way of organizing production, either consciously or unconsciously.
So you mentioned Apple,
Yep.
and whilst you were speaking, I couldn't help but think something that again, we don't mean to speak badly of Apple. They make all of my things, but the I couldn't help but wonder a few years ago when they announced like Apple Card in the US, and like it was their financial credit card, attempt, right? So whilst you were speaking, I couldn't help but think that might, that kind of fits the narrative there, right? Like they had products that were selling really well, and growing. Mac, market was growing. iOS, iPhone market was growing, and then this kind of strange pivot into credit cards, with and it makes sense in some ways, right? They've got a ton of money sitting there doing nothing. They can loan it out, gain, turn it into profit in terms of interest. But does that analogy kind of fit what you're talking about in a more global context? Like this pivot towards something that is financial is the key here.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect example actually of what I'm talking about. It's precisely they've accumulated an enormous amount of reserve capital that they don't have a worthwhile place to invest it, right? There's only they're selling about as many iPhones and MacBooks and whatnot as they can, I presume. And so if they have that cash just sitting there, then it's going to be, losing value if it's just sitting there. So they want to find ways um, uh, to capitalize on it, quite literally, and the financial in the lack of other potential outlets, the financialization like credit cards and what have you is a perfect example, right? GE did the same thing, um, switching from or building off of its production of appliances and energy generators and what have you to become one of the biggest credit firms in the U.S. I think. So yeah,
Right. I mean, we obviously live in Korea, so we're used to these chaebol companies expanding into various different um, verticals. Samsung with Samsung Card, Hyundai, making cars, but also making lifts and elevators and stuff. So yeah, that's I. So this can apply not only to global system nation states, but to multinationals, companies as well.
with some hesitation, I'll agree to that. Sure.
Well, it sounds to me that they're simply following the same path, though, right? Just like a multinational, because it doesn't start out as a multinational um, with selling financial instruments. It starts out, I mean, in the case of Samsung or like Apple. We're not sponsored by Apple. It starts out as just, basically a garage project. Um, and just as these systemic cycles, they begin with a system of, commercialization of based more on trade. These companies, their profits are based more uh, on selling actually physical products. So is basically what I'm wondering is, does kind of everyone who gets to get in on the system from the start, are they also are they forced into following this, private actors just as much as public actors forced into this the same boundaries of these cycles?
Huh. I don't haven't reflected on that previously, so which is the great thing about having these kind of conversations. But I definitely think that's a possibility. There's nothing. I mean, my cautions would and concerns would be that there's nothing uh, necessary about the new firms starting up at the beginning of a cycle and sort of having the same lifespan as a cycle. These systemic cycles of accumulation have gotten shorter and shorter, so it may become a bit more like that in the contemporary period. Um, but but one can think of other examples like the British East India Company that also pretty much parallels the same span of the British phase, British cycle. So this would be an interesting idea to explore. And it may be also another way of exploring it might be to tie it to different technological innovations, right? There's going to be, again, I haven't read these things yet, but I'm sure there is a school that is going to suggest that there are particular technologies that sort of underlie each shift in shift in cycles of accumulation. So, the most obvious one would be industrialization and the invention of the steam engine that brings in the British cycle. We might posit that early computer technology in the U.S. begins to introduce the U.S. system. So I mean, there might be some mileage that we could squeeze out of that. Um, but again, to take Arrighi's the way he sets up his book is that his book is, as he describes it, an effort to uh, construct theories about the past based on the needs of the present and understanding the needs of the present and changes in the present. So, uh, given the deeply technological nature of our current moment, uh, this would be the technological question would be an interesting one to explore. And just to push it one step further, uh, the advent of AI, to get ahead of ourselves a little bit, may also be one of these ways of trying to invest in a new cycle of accumulation.
So you mentioned that these cycles, these systemic cycles, are like shortening, but I was quite interested in understanding, what does it mean exactly that capitalism itself expands with each cycle?
Well, the basic notion behind that is, and certainly from the Marxian perspective, is that capitalism has to keep expanding if it is to survive. Right? We have to, this is one of the fundamental notions behind Marxist thinking is that if capital fails to continue to accumulate, then the system itself gets bogged down and faces a crisis which may undermine itself and lead to the end of the system. So, so there is in a certain sense a way that expansion, as long as there is capitalism, there will be expansion.
And is that why, you know, we're used to seeing on the news, GDP is up, GDP is down? Is that why we focus so heavily on GDP as a measure.
That is why some people focus so much on GDP as a measure.
Sure.
Yes.
Not everyone. um, okay, so yeah, gross domestic product. It talks about growth. Um,
Yeah,
so
and
that leads into what you were saying.
yeah, I mean, the GDP measure itself really is only a measure of the size of the economy and the amount of transactions in the economy. And that's what ultimately matters to capitalists if they're trying to make money, right? It doesn't matter what kind of business it is, as long as there is a profit to be obtained, then it counts as economic activity. And that's what the GDP was originally developed by Robert Solow to do. But even he disavowed it as a you know completely worthwhile measure of economic activity in the end. Uh, but let me add one more thing to the uh, need to expand in each cycle, because there is also a sense here, I think, in which, and I may be projecting this onto Arrighi, but in which the sort of systemic organization of world capitalism also sort of, as it transitions into a new form, it also builds on what had been there before and what new um, arrangements have been developed during one cycle of accumulation um, aren't necessarily destroyed. They may just be transformed in a way that makes them more efficient, more profitable, more productive along the way. And so we kind of, one might say that we have an organizational accumulation of the global system.
I think I think that's something I could definitely see. Even in the four systemic cycles mentioned in the book, you can see the links between it. It's kind of like a one up. The networks of trade, the technology of that time. It's not fully dismantled. It's built upon, built upon, built upon, to the point that we're at now.
But okay, Lou, you started touching on this earlier. I am curious about this. Why does it shorten? Like, what is that telling us? So it's expanding. That's interesting. But why? Because I feel like when you hear like shortening, to me that indicates it could just be an assumption that's wrong. Something about instability. If something's not able to prop itself up as long. So is it because there's instability, or is there something else happening that's causing these oscillations to happen faster?
Yeah, well, I think where Arrighi would come from and where the general Marxian perspective would come from would be to say that this is that capitalism as a system, as it accumulates capital and accumulates capital more rapidly, it more rapidly uh, uh, moves towards new crises, and that those crises get worse and worse over time. So the notion would be that, uh, or one way of understanding it would be that during earlier periods, the accumulation of capital was not so rapid that uh, we might look at earlier phases of capitalist accumulation as taking place more slowly. Just because maybe the technology isn't there, maybe the profit rates aren't there, the system itself isn't quite as efficient, but eventually it does reach a point of crisis. And then when the new phase comes and is more efficient, it means that that new, more efficient system can accumulate capital more rapidly, which brings the crisis, the real existential crisis of that cycle of accumulation, uh, closer and earlier, and that this perpetuates itself over time. Um,
It reminds me of a car. If you ignore a problem, that problem's going to arise quicker, and then you ignore it again, and the problem's going to arise a bit quicker next time, and then eventually it goes bang. Um, so is that where we're headed? I feel like this is the right place to ask this question. Is that where we're headed? Are we going towards a bang?
Well, at the end of every cycle of accumulation, there is a bang of systemic chaos. And if you ask Arrighi when he was writing in the 80s, he was imagining that it was coming up soon. Um, and I would say that, yeah, we're in the middle of that bang already myself.
Everything seems quite fine.
That's not the way you started the podcast.
Yeah, no. I'm looking outside. There's birds singing. Weather's nice.
Yeah, today is gorgeous.
Yeah. So in more concrete terms, what do these bangs look like in at the end of past cycles?
It pretty much looks like war. There
Okay.
are, each transition pretty much has been accompanied by global scale war. The shift from the Spanish Genoese to the Dutch is all about the war between the Spanish and the Dutch. Then from the Dutch to the British, it's a little less um, violent, I think, but it certainly involved the British taking over quite a few of the Dutch trading ports and what have you to expand their own trading network. And the phase between the British and the US is, the two world wars that we saw at the beginning of the 20th century. So one might argue, it's hard from our own perspective to say that there is more war today, but it sure feels like there is quite a bit of conflict or impending conflict today that might suggest that uh, or maybe not enough war yet, in a sad sort of way, to initiate or to complete this next transition.
That was bleak.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, the moment of optimism is not now.
Yeah, we'll have to put a warning at the beginning.
So each of these cycles comes on faster, and some sort of conflict, large or relatively small, signifies the end and transition. Is that leading to an inevitable conflict in our future, or is it something that potentially could be avoided? Or we're not trying to predict the future here, but is this essentially a roadmap, or is there room to maneuver?
It's a good question, and I think Giovanni Arrighi's answer is probably the best one, or at least a very good one, which is that in a sense, he hedges his bets, right? But to the extent that history is contingent, and that uh, even the initiation of different phases or cycles of accumulation can be based on really just some, you know, theoretically random fact about, say, the Dutch controlling the Baltic Ocean or the Baltic Sea when naval stores became important, that allowed them to become the hegemon, that gave them the accumulation of capital that allowed them to ascend. There's nothing uh, inevitable about any of these historical developments. And so Arrighi is very careful to say, we can't say that this cycle of accumulation is going to end, that it's going to end now, that it necessarily is ending, or that there will be any more in the future. What he does say is that, pretty much from the 70s onward, we begin to see the financialization of the American economy. This is the whole neoliberal piece and the outsourcing piece, in which the U.S. economy becomes this sort of center of financial control of the global and control and management of the global economy. And so, if these patterns hold, then it currently looks like to him that we were approaching the end of an American systemic cycle of accumulation. Since he's written the book and in the contemporary period, my take, and again, my take is that we are in an incredibly turbulent time. When I was young, it felt great. I was in the 70s, early 80s. I always used to complain, I wish I lived in more interesting times. But now I know why uh, may you live in interesting times is a bit of a curse. Uh, I would be happy to go back to simpler, less interesting times. Um, but I do think we are living in an interesting time today, and but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to go that the cycle is ending. That there isn't a way that uh, uh, the financial interests of the U.S. will not find a way to perpetuate their hegemonic uh, uh, um, position. But what Arrighi was suggesting is that, and many of the world systems theories folks were suggesting at that time, was that with the rise of the East, that China was likely to become the next global hegemon. They weren't committing to it, but to them, it looked like it. In fact, to the extent that Arrighi then went on to write a book on Adam Smith in Beijing in order to study China's rise, and so he believed that China was on the way up. Me, I'm not so sure.
So when it comes, just like taking his argument that the at least the American, the system is on its way out. We can just based on that trend of going from commercialization to financialization, we will expect that to happen too. Are there any other trends or patterns that we could expect about the next uh, hegemon based on certain variables or traits that he notices in his theory?
Okay. Well, again, this is my take and my twist on Arrighi. I think this is implicit in what Arrighi argues and explains, but I don't think he actually is ever particularly explicit about it. And I think if we look over these long cycles of accumulation, these long centuries, what we see is a shift in the balance of the logics of power. So the way Arrighi sets things up is to identify two broad logics of power in the global economy. One is the territorial logic of power, and one is the capitalist logic of power. And the territorialist logic of power is perhaps the easier one to imagine. You can sort of go back to any historical empire or what have you, the medieval period, where actors who are interested or uh, pursue the territorial logic of power see power as the control of territory and the peoples that are within them. And so the territorial logic of power is to use capital to expand territory. So, which typically means you're a prince, you're a king, you're an emperor, you're Genghis Khan, whatever it is. You take whatever spoils of war or whatever uh, resources you've taxed away from your citizens inside your territory, and you use that to buy weapons, to buy uh, resources that you can then use to conquer new territories and expand your territory. So the territorial logic of power uses capital to expand territory, and with the key goal being expanding territory. Whereas the capitalist logic of power, the key goal is to accumulate capital. And that may entail um, employing territory as a tool of accumulating more capital. So, you know, you might, you might try to create a colony in order to have access to commodities or resources that you can then sell in order to accumulate capital. So your goal, the capitalist goal, isn't the territory per se. It's territory as a tool for accumulating capital. And you could even think of it from the capitalist position as a machine, right? I mean, territory is no different from a machine that produces more efficiently or something like this. It's just a new source of accumulation.
So then how have these logics alternated between different periods, and which logic is at play now, and which logic would you expect to see then with a future hegemon like China?
Right. So it's not that these logics alternate, according to Arrighi. They're always both there. What and again, this is my extension of or reading of Arrighi, is that I think the balance of power has shifted between them historically, where at the earlier period, the territorial logic of power was the more dominant force in the partnership between the two, because the two work in partnership. But that over time, the capitalist logic has become more and more dominant. So maybe to make that concrete, maybe it's worthwhile talking about the particular cycles of accumulation, so that we can get a sense of how these logics of power have related historically.
So in concrete terms, when we look at these logics of power, how do they play out in each cycle?
Right. So as I was suggesting, both logics of power are present at all time, and it's about the balance between them or the relationship between them. And so, if we take a sort of historical look, maybe we can sort of run through what these relations look like. So, um, the initial phase is the Genoese phase, according to Arrighi. So, at the end of the 1400s, the middle of the 1400s, we have a period in which the city states of northern Italy's trade networks were becoming destabilized as the Mongol Empire had retreated and as they made their own efforts to try to influence and manage the countries or kingdoms to their north in the Dutch, the Spanish, the French, and so they became a bit weaker. At the same time that the Spanish and the Portuguese begin to uh, seek to spread the word of God, I guess is the way to say it. So, what you have, according to Arrighi at this time, is you have the Genoese looking for new ways to invest their capital because the previous ways that they've been investing it have become unstable and risky because of deteriorating quality of the trade routes to the east. And then you have the Iberian Peninsula with its strong military uh, seeking to expand territorially with what I think Arrighi refers to as a Crusades logic, right? One of the main goals of the Spanish and Portuguese was to spread the word of God, to convert people to Christianity, to glorify the kingdom of God around the world. And so they have a logic that's really a territorial logic of expansion, right? They're going to spend their money, their gold, in order to buy ships to send conquistadors to the New World, et cetera, et cetera. Um, but they're not really, and they're interested in accumulating gold for sure, but they're not, but one of their big uh, interests is not a capitalist interest. Whereas the Genoese have the capital, they don't have uh, really the wherewithal to expand territorially. So the solution they light upon is to finance the Spanish expansion. And so this is that first Genoese cycle of accumulation, during which time the Genoese build a financial network throughout Europe that is an enormous financial innovation that allows, for instance, travelers and traders to go from city to city simply with promissory notes that allow them to withdraw capital from a bank in Amsterdam based on a promissory note from Milan or something like this. Um, and so we have this initial cycle of accumulation. But what eventually happens is that the process of colonialism becomes too expensive, right? So even the costs of maintaining a particular systemic cycle of accumulation, a particular social formation for capital accumulation becomes more expensive at the end of each of these cycles, which is something that we haven't talked about before. And it and Spanish efforts to uh, maintain control of the Netherlands at the time uh, creates tension between the two, and uh, simultaneously, the Dutch are innovating militarily with their seafaring technologies, um, and are benefiting from having basically or establishing a monopoly on trade out of the Baltic Sea. This is one of those fun historical contingency moments that is just fascinating in some ways. There's no theory that can predict that this is going to be the case. It just happens to be that because of the expanding seafaring going on as the Spanish expand their empire and as the Dutch expand their own trading efforts, it turns out that um, uh, goods related to seafaring become some of the most important commodities of the time. And they basically come out of the eastern side of the Baltic Sea, Russia, Scandinavia, etc. So you're talking about, timber for boats, for masts in particular, and curiously enough, um, the sort of tar and pitch that you need to actually waterproof boats. Really, I mean, sorry to get excited about this, but it's amazing that the need to turn pine tree sap into waterproofing is what gives the Dutch the ability to accumulate enough capital uh, to expand their own trade networks. Um, there's also a monopoly on grain as well as demand for grain increases, um, but the one that's fun is the tars. Um, and uh, with um, the the Spanish Dutch War, in which the Dutch eventually win, we see the sort of end of the. I mean, that is the sort of systemic chaos between the two cycles of accumulation, and then the Dutch advance and more or less take over most of the trade routes that the Spanish had established particularly in the East, not necessarily in the New World, although the Dutch presence they had presence there as well. But so what the Dutch do, right? So in that earlier phase, you have the capitalists and the the capitalist logic and the territorial logic are very clearly separated. With the Dutch, they become a little bit closer, in which you have the House of Orange as the state providing basically the military cover, the muscle that builds the trade routes and protects the trade routes for Dutch merchants. And once they've taken over these routes, there's a couple of characteristics that make the Dutch phase fairly unique. The first is that they are not so concerned with taking over entire territories. They're concerned with establishing trading posts. You can think of Malacca, you can think of Batavia, now Jakarta. Um, uh, you can think of Macau, places like this that are um, uh, points from which Dutch merchants can exchange with local rulers, right? So the local rulers still manage the broader territories, but the Dutch trade through treaties or through forcing monopolies of exchange on local territories. But they don't actually focus on taking over those territories and controlling those territories per se. So what you have is a big global network of trading posts for the most part. So that's one characteristic that's interesting about the Dutch phase. The other is that all of those networks, all of the lines come back to Amsterdam and point to Amsterdam. So in more or less, Amsterdam becomes the warehouse for the world. All trading goods get brought from around the globe ish into Amsterdam, where they are gathered into the warehouses before being transshipped to another place for sale. So basically, the Dutch dominate the global trading network by being the center of commodity exchange. Simultaneously, they also developed the Bourse, which is basically the first stock exchange, uh, which creates the um, a whole financial system for collective financing of these enterprises along the way, and becomes eventually a place of speculation. Right, this is where the tulip mania takes place, and yeah, and so this is kind of the Dutch phase. But of course, these trading networks as well become more and more expensive to maintain, in particular because uh, other countries from the continent primarily uh, begin to imitate the Dutch model and to try to create their own mercantilist networks. Right, this is the British are trying to do this, the French are trying to do this, trying to create their own mercantilist networks in which they dominate trade in different places. And so the increasing competition there, Arrighi argues, increases the cost um, uh, of defending those trade routes, and makes the military costs of maintaining those trade routes much less steady, much less predictable. One of the innovations, to go back a step, that Arrighi argues is that one of the main Dutch innovations was to internalize the cost of protection, which allowed, because there was minimal competition, it allowed the cost of maintaining those trade networks, of protecting those trade networks, to be predictable, which allows profits to be predictable, which allows merchants to make much more rational, predictable decisions about what kind of trading to do. But once the competition increases from the British, the French, etc., um, then those costs increase. And so the Dutch begin, having accumulated quite a bit of capital, they begin to look for other ways and other places to invest their capital. And to a certain extent, this is also where the Dutch, in a sense, kind of undermine themselves, because unlike the Spanish, which tried to dominate all trade and keep finances domestic, the Dutch allowed for joint ventures with external actors. So you begin to see the development of joint stock companies between Dutch and British merchants, and so you see Dutch capital beginning basically to migrate to other parts of the continent, and in particular, it migrates uh, uh, to Britain, where we see and where we see it financing and capitalizing on these new forms of production. Industrial The Industrial Revolution is taking place, and Dutch capital is going in to help build the factories, to help build mass production facilities that allow this new form of production to take place, and facilitates the emergence of the British uh, cycle of accumulation. And then with the British cycle of accumulation, we see, in a sense, this a new way of setting up the global global economic system, which involves a number of characteristics, but at least two that are directly pertinent to us now. One is the direct control of territory, unlike the Dutch, which was content for the most part to focus on simple trade, nodes. The British decide that they're going to directly control entire territories, um, and like the subcontinent and what have you, and uh, well, mentioning the subcontinent, one of the striking innovations is, of course, something like the British East India Company, which functions both as a military power and a trading power, and a government itself for the subcontinent during this period. Uh, so, um, so there is this direct economic and or capitalist and territorial control of uh, external territories. The other piece of it that Arrighi uh, notes is that as Britain accumulated capital, it also made the move toward free trade, or what Arrighi calls free trade imperialism, in which, I mean, it's not true free trade, but to a certain extent, Britain opened its own markets to other investors from around the world, like the Dutch, like the French, etc., so that people could you know, uh, produce goods and sell them in the UK, or I guess it wasn't the UK at the time. Um, there you go. My history isn't clear on the emergence of the UK as a formal entity, uh, but but this kind of open markets uh, create that hegemonic role in which uh, everyone wanted to sell to Britain, uh, because that's where the capital was. There was an enormously high level of consumption uh, available. And so this is why you have Marx talking, and Adam Smith and Ricardo talking about Portugal selling wine to the UK. Um, so it is this free trade imperialism that becomes characteristic of it. But again, uh, as as the sun does begin to set on the empire, the costs of colonialism become more and more expensive towards the end of the 1800s. And this is where you start to see the beginnings of what we now call development, But we also see enough tension globally, um, as uh, other powers in Europe jump on the industrial bandwagon and begin to weaken British dominance globally, leading us to the world wars of the early 20th century, during which the Americans are increasingly pushing for the colonies as well to have these open markets. And so, as sort of post World War II, um, we have the ascendance of the Americans as the global hegemon, which they try to establish or they do establish by undermining territorial domination by European powers of their colonies, by opening those markets so that um, so that American firms can invest there as well. And they also do so by establishing the new rules of global trade, right? They set up the UN, they set up the IMF, they set up the World Bank, the other Bretton Woods institutions, in such a way that the US itself has the dominant voice in determining what decisions are made in those organizations. And of course, the US also emerges as um, with competition from the Soviets, but pretty much as the preeminent military power of the time, uh, that uh, um, that gives it a potential role as a coercive hegemon, but it in Arrighi's sense. So there's a sense in which um, countries might want to follow it, but what Arrighi also argues is that this set of ideas from the United Nations of free self-determination of peoples, of democratic decision making, what we might call today soft power of the American model, allowed it to become the hegemon because it represented and helped, in theory, helped promote these ideals around the world, and that encouraged emerging states to follow in its wake and to work with the U.S. to foster the U.S.'s hegemonic position globally. Um, but then, uh, as this sort of economic domination through soft power establishes itself, it also uh, begins to become too expensive for the U.S. to try to uh, remain as um, the core of the gold standard, right? And now we're venturing into the economic side, which is also a place where I'm an interloper. So I just interlope everywhere here, uh, picking pieces and putting them together. Um, but but the U.S. frees up, as we know, in the 71, I believe, uh, uh, releases floats the U.S. dollar, and this creates a new sort of global economy that loosens capital itself from its territorial fixation within the U.S. and allows for globalization as we now know it to happen more freely because capital is able to move around the globe in a much more free manner. And that also, of course, uh, um, facilitates the offshoring of production, which again, in turn, is driven by the growing costs of maintaining um, the American systemic cycle of accumulation, right? We're in these shorter periods here from 1945 to 1970, the sort of golden period that Thomas Piketty talks about, where labor had a generous share of the profits and what have you. What capital eventually decides is that uh, labor's share is too big. It's too expensive for them to uh, continue to rely on the Fordist system of production that is in place in the U.S. And so there is this push to offshore and globalize investments. That eventually, of course, leads to massive investment in China as a way of undermining the power of U.S. labor and well, yeah, exactly that, of undermining the power of U.S. labor and providing new avenues for accumulating capital, uh, which brings us to where we are today.
Honestly, during that, you apologized for finding it exciting, and I just want to say this is a safe space for that kind of lesson because I was fascinated throughout,
Awesome.
and I probably speak for our listeners as well, that they will too. So I totally buy what you were saying earlier about the logics of power, that they kind of work in tandem, like one is probably bigger than the other. They're just two expanding rubber bands. One's bigger than the other at one time, and then they wax and wane. So we obviously live in a time where we're building huge data centers, right? And they require territory in the form of space. But what they produce is way, beyond, the value of in some cases, way beyond the value of the land that they're built on. So if we were to think about it, we would be in a capitalist led logic phase, right? Like this is definitely a time when we can produce way more value from, small spaces of parcels of land than we've ever been able to do before. Um, and we're even considering, Microsoft did a test off the coast of Scotland about putting data centers underwater. And I believe I read something about Google exploring the opportunity of putting data centers in space. So yeah, would you agree with that? It's definitely capitalist logic led, not entirely, but led.
Yeah, I absolutely would, right? So both of these logics of power are coexistent over time, and my my thinking is that the relationship has become increasingly deterritorialized. That the role of territory um, and hence the territorial logic of power has become less important over time, and certainly less dominant over time. Whereas the capitalist logic has increased. And yes, I think this is where I differ from Arrighi in thinking that in the emerging systemic cycle of accumulation, we have uh, we will see the global dominance and coordination of the global economy by more or less the tech sector, which is a more deterritorialized sector than previous sectors, and that sector will become less and less dependent on territorial states to pursue its own interests. So, yeah, so that's where I think we're going, as opposed to China becoming the hegemon.
And if we could, like, so in those four examples, like, there's obviously indicators as to why they transitioned, but is there anything glaringly obvious? We've mentioned AI and the rapid rise of like technology. Is that the only outlier in the transitions, or are there some things that are potentially unique to this period that didn't exist?
Well, I think there's something unique in every period, and in each transition. I know, and again, the ancient history, a few hundred years ago, ancient for us Americans, is um, eh, was one of naval innovation that allowed for the rise of the Dutch. British also had military innovation in parallel with the steam engine. I mean, which was obviously, a huge transformation for humanity, perhaps even more significant than AI is going to be, um, or our contemporary digitization of society is going to be. Maybe not. Um, with the switch from the British to the Americans, I mean, if it is computers and the transistor that is the source of, or at least parallel technology for that transition, then um, uh, then we have another one for that. Um, so I don't see them I don't see these changes necessarily as that much as necessarily differing on sort of in amplitude, if you will, or in scale, right? I think all of these transitions have been major and significant and world-changing transitions. So I don't know that I would say that the current transformation is any more extreme or um, than the steam engine.
But perhaps more rapid, as we've already alluded to.
Yes, I mean, absolutely more rapid. Yeah.
It's been quite the conversation, thanks to Cuz. And we've only scratched the surface still of Arrighi's predictions and his theory, but it's given us plenty of thought about what comes next.
Which is what we'll be discussing in our next episode on this series, which returns in December, maybe earlier if I can edit it properly. Next time, we'll be joined by Professor Potter again to discuss the Dark Enlightenment, network states, patchwork cities, and the future of the capitalist system. All exciting stuff. Thank you very much for listening, and join us next time.